Okay, we are back to Hoover today, and we are going to um, talk more about the events of his presidency, which, yes, does start talking about the Great Depression, but there's a little bit more than that, so I want to make sure that we um, do it justice by talking about more than just that. Um, Here is one of his campaign posters. So this would have been put in a home because it says this is a Hoover home. Stability, vision, integrity, and experience. And that's what they thought that they were getting when Hoover was becoming president. Here was really a worldwide hero um, coming to a position of leadership just based on his ability to um, organize and solve problems. So you'd think, wow, here's a problem solver in the White House at the time of a super big problem like the Depression. So this is perfect for him. But, and we'll get into this in just a minute, it has to do also with what your view of the government's role is and what you will allow the government to do. He is not just a citizen anymore. As a citizen, he would have done so much. He would have started organizations, he would have given personally, and he did give personally. Okay? But as the president, what does he feel is the nation's duty? And he has to look ahead and see what are the effects of this. If I start it now, okay, what will happen because of what I did 5 years, 50 years down the road? A president cannot just react. He has to think well and clearly and realize that his actions are having effect and what effect are his actions having. So, a hard job, I wouldn't want it. Okay? So, but when Hoover comes into the presidency, he actually comes in very active. He comes in almost a little bit progressively, wanting to make some changes. And he has certain things on his mind that he wants to improve. Remember, this is someone who really wants to make a difference. And there are things that he believes that the government can do to make a difference in certain areas. So he comes into office early 1929. The depression doesn't, the stock market doesn't crash until October. So between when he first gets into office early in the year until October, these are some of the things that he's working on. Okay? So, one, he was a conservationist, a little bit like Theodore Roosevelt. He set aside 300 million acres as national parks. One of those included arches, which is a really cool one to look up. Big rock formations that look like just a huge arch. Um, he began prison reform, creating schools for the prison workers, so the people who would be working in the prisons. He wanted to make sure that they were educated and they had proper pay. And he started work on building more prisons to help with overcrowding. So he saw this as a major problem that he needed to address when he came into the White House. He increased the federal budget to include children's programs. This is the first time that children's programs specifically are being addressed in the federal budget. And he hosted, this was in 1930, he hosted the very first White House conference on child health and protection and creating the Children's Charter of Rights. So, what are some things that we need to make sure that all children have, and how can we do that? And a lot of this had to do with education, had to do with feeding. Okay, making sure that children received proper nourishment and food. So that's interesting. I think that's cool. That's something he comes in and wants. That's an initiative of his, something he wants to make happen, not Congress, something that he is moving forward. He knew that the farmers out west were struggling. Remember, Coolidge didn't want to pass a farm relief bill, and Hoover knew that there was some problems with the farmers, and so he created the Federal Farm Board to help relieve some of these problems. But Hoover's belief in helping relieve some of these problems was not just here's some money, okay? It was what can we do to make sure that they get a fair price for their crops, okay? That kind of thing. What is the government in charge of that we can make sure we're upholding our end as long as they are still producing their crops and that kind of thing. But the problem is, are they always going to be producing crops? No, and they start having some big problems here in a little bit that we're going to talk about. He doubled the money that was being spent on the current Indian Bureau. Right now, we still have this organization, but it's called the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So it's how our relationships with the Native Americans. But he doubled the money spent towards them, trying to reverse some of the harm that we had done to them in the past. And a lot of that money went towards schools and towards health care. So I love this for screen. This shows someone coming in, not just laying back and putting his feet up and not wanting to do something, because that wouldn't be Hoover-esque. It wouldn't be like Hoover. Hoover has spent his whole life solving problems and trying to help people. Of course that's what he would do, coming into the White House. But yet we know him in a completely different way. And this is why. Okay? Well, I don't think we're there yet. Another thing. I'm not done with some of the things that he did. He directed federal law enforcement to crack down on Chicago crime. So remember I said Prohibition was a time of gangsters, and a lot of it was centered in the Chicago area. So he directed the federal law enforcement to help the local people to crack down on that, because it was getting bad. There were some large crime called massacres where lots of people were being killed, and it was all because of this kind of underground crime going on in Chicago in the 20s. Towards the foreign countries, he had what's called a good neighbor foreign policy. And he immediately, as soon as he got into office, began improving relationships with Latin American countries. And he took a big tour. That's what this is called, a goodwill tour, in 1928 to kind of improve these relationships with these countries. And he removed U.S. troops from several Latin American countries to basically, and they were just there kind of in kind of a controlling way. So he said, look, we're going to pull back, and we're going to just have goodwill policy. We're going to be here to help you, but we're not going to be forcing our power onto you. And we don't want you to feel like we're trying to take your land or take anything away. So he had a really good relationship there with the Latin American countries. And this really doesn't have anything to do with policy, but I thought it was cool. He was the first president to have a phone on his desk. Okay, and I like this picture of him with his dog. Okay. Now, enter the Depression. Okay, we have this president who comes in, who has a strong, heroic image, who is coming in, and he's not a do-nothing. He's trying to make a change. Black Tuesday. The stock market crashes on October 29th, 1929. What that means is all of the people were investing money into companies, and they were now, what happens though is when the people who were investing some of this money for the people, the brokers, then say, you owe me all this money. Can you pay me your money? Well, they didn't have it. So the brokers were taking out money out of the banks or out of the stock market. What happened was in the 1920s, a lot of people were spending money they did not have. Okay? And then when you do that, it's going to come to a head. Something's going to happen. And then, so people lost money. All that money fell out of the stock market. Okay? Billions of dollars were lost for companies. Now, here's how it affects. And now, not everyone has money in the stock market. So you say, well, that doesn't affect me. And there were people in West Virginia that it didn't affect, especially at the beginning. Okay? But you have these big companies who have invested all this money, and the big companies lose millions of dollars. Now, what does that big company have to do? Fire the workers that worked for them. Okay? Now that's affecting regular people. Now that person got fired and can't find another job, and now they can't pay for their house. Now they can't pay for their car. Okay, do you see? And now they can't find another job because that's happening everywhere. All of these companies are closing. All of these companies are firing people. And then it just, now, because they don't have as much money, people aren't buying as much. So then I'm not going out and buying a new dress. So now that company has to lay off workers because I'm not spending any money. Do you see? The economy is a big circle. And if it's not working, people are going to lose jobs, they're going to lose money, and then other people are going to lose jobs and lose money, and other people are going to lose jobs and lose money. Do you see? So it just goes in a big circle. Then people go to their banks and they go, I want my money out of my bank. Okay? They're afraid, they're nervous, things are going on, so they go to the bank and say, I want all my money. Well, the bank uses money in a kind of circular way. They hold on to your money and they promise to have it when you want it, but it's circulating the money. It's moving it around. It doesn't keep that one amount in a vault the whole time. So I go to the bank and I say, I demand my $5,000. So they give it to me. But then the next person comes and does that. Then the next person comes and does that. And now the banks don't have enough money to pay out everything that they had promised, and now they began to fall in the thousands. So banks are failing. Okay? So in the next 2 years, so after 1929, that first year, not as many people felt it. But as it keeps going on, more and more and more and more people start to feel it. During the next 2 years, 100,000 jobs were lost every week. Every week, millions of people were out of work. And when that happens, the depression continues and it worsens. And it gets worse and worse and worse. The pictures here are people looking for jobs. You've got a picture here. This is a bread line. There were places that gave out free soup and bread, and people would come and line up so that they could get food. And what you have during this time is not just people who have never had anything, that have always been poor. You have people who had a house, who had a car, who had something, and now don't have anything because everything was all of a sudden gone. Okay, and there wasn't a way to make it back. So here's where we need to talk for a minute. The government can respond in a couple different ways. Okay, here's the two main ways you could react. One, the government tries to do what it feels like it can do on its end, okay? It tries to support the economy and does what it can to support business. So that would have to do with taxes or tariffs, trying to create jobs, okay? So that people can then go to work and can make money for themselves. So the government is working to lay this foundation under here so that the people can work and then make their own money. One of the problems with that is when you have a big depression and it hits very suddenly and it's multiplying lots and lots and lots, that kind of reaction doesn't work very quickly. So more and more people lose jobs, more and more people grow hungry, and you're losing money by the tons. Okay, and more damage can be done because it's not a very quick fix. But if you give it some time, it might come back, because we've learned, right, already in history, that our economy does this. How many times have we heard the panic of this, the panic of that, the panic of this? Our economy is always doing this. It's got its ups, it's got its downs. Okay? And most economists know that if you ride those downs, long enough, you'll have another up. Okay? Now, the other reaction is to give money directly to the people through government programs. So direct support. So recently, because of all of this stuff going on with COVID-19 and people being laid off of jobs, the government gave a stimulus check. Okay, so they directly gave us money. Why did they give us that money? One, it was because people are being laid off and they need something to get through. But sometimes we have stimulus checks to stimulate the economy, meaning so that I'll continue to buy stuff. If I don't have any money, am I going to go to the grocery store? No. Then what's going to happen to the grocery store? It's going to go down. So it's important that I keep spending money. But if I don't have money, I can't spend it. So the government gave us a stimulus check to help us still be able to spend money so that some of those other things wouldn't go under while some of us currently don't have a job. Okay? But think about the long-term effect of that. And I'm not just talking about the stimulus check, because that's kind of a one-time thing. Another way to do it is to create government programs so that if you're, let's say it's for the elderly. So if you're a certain age, you would get a check every month. Okay? If you, let's say if you don't make a certain amount of money, you get a check every month. All right, let's say if you can apply to this, you get a check every month. So there's different programs that can give money to people on a regular basis, not a one time. Well, what's the long-term effect of that? If I am all the time getting a check from the government, what am I maybe not going to do? It's possible that I'm not going to feel the need to get a job, right? And if I grow up seeing that, and I know that I can get a check from the government, maybe my children won't get jobs. Okay? So there are a lot of, and it has to do with your role of government, your idea of your role of government. Hoover did not want to do it this way. He did not believe that giving money directly to the people was good. He thought that it would lead to problems in the future and becoming more dependent upon the government. So when we see FDR come in next, he starts creating all these programs just by the hundreds, okay, trying to get money out to the people, which eventually will help us come out of the Depression. We still have a long time to go, but eventually will help. But those programs never went away, and it did create some of the long-term problems that Hoover was worried about. Okay, so it's about, what is the government's role? Is the government's role to directly make sure that I have a living? Or is the government's role to care for the economy so that if I'm willing to work, I can do well? And that's what Hoover believed. The government's job was to try to support the economy, which was hard during this time too, so that people who are willing to work can make money. Okay? So, what does he do? Here's some of the things that he does. He passes a tariff. Now, by the time this tariff got through Congress, it looked completely different than what he wanted, and he knew it was not going to be wonderful, but he passed it anyway. It raised the United States tariff rates to make us buy more United States products, right? Because that would help our businesses. So we wanted to help our businesses. But because we raised our tariffs, other countries weren't doing well financially either, and they didn't want to buy our goods, so we didn't sell them, so it caused more job loss. So this actually didn't work well, and it actually caused more harm than good. Okay. Another one was the Davis-Bacon Act, which made contractors, so there were some programs being supported by the government called federal projects. Hoover Dam was one of them, and large building projects that were putting people to work. And it made the contractors pay fair wages to those workers. Okay, you can't just pay them the very minimum. This is what it made, a minimum to what they could pay them. Now, FDR gets a lot of credit for this, but Hoover actually began this before he left office. But some people say it was just a little bit too late. It was a little bit too little, a little bit too late. And it was the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. And it was the government was actually putting money back into local government and into banks and railroads and other businesses so that they wouldn't fail. So this was money going directly to railroads and businesses to help them be able to stay alive. Hoover also did a lot to encourage private groups and organizations to help. He was all the time telling people, you do what you can for your neighbor. He was encouraging the wealthy ones. There were people that still had money. There were. I was reading today about Milton Hershey. Milton Hershey's company continued. It lost money. It did not do as well, but it continued through the Depression, and he actually started building a bunch of buildings in his town so that he was creating jobs for people. Do you see? Now that is an American taking it on himself to try to help other people because he had the ability. And that's what Hoover wanted people to do. That's what Hoover would have done as a personal citizen. And a student of mine last year said, maybe Hoover would have done more good as a private citizen during this time than president. And I think that's probably true. I think we would still hear his name as a hero if he had been a private citizen and not president, because he would have stepped up and done some big things. But because he was president, he had to take on that presidential role of controlling the government, which is different than controlling his own funds and his own business. Okay? So, things continue to get even worse. The Dust Bowl starts happening out west because they have over-farmed those fields. The dirt and soil is really loose. Severe drought hits. We have all these big dust storms, and it just kills those farms even more. And many of them pack up and leave and go to California to look for jobs, but couldn't find jobs there. So our farmers are being hurt, which is food supply, all kinds of different things, right? So then we have a bunch of World War I veterans who were promised a bonus in 1945, but they want it early because they're poor and they need help now. So they plan this big march on to D.C. And they come to D.C. and kind of demand their bonus pay, and they're denied, and many of them do go home. But there are a few thousand that stay, and they camp out, and they're going to say, we're not leaving until you give us some money. Well, problems break out with the local police, and when they do, they beg the government to send in federal troops. So Hoover sends in federal troops to help control this bonus army, okay, which is what they were called, the bonus army. And Hoover said, specifically to the leader, with as little force as possible. I have read several things that said that he did that. But what do? They go and do exactly the opposite. They throw like tear gas into crowds. They burn down their tent camps that they've got set up. And what does that do? It makes Hoover look heartless. That here were these veterans that served in World War I. Not only is he not giving them money, but he's burning them out and he's putting tear gas. But it wasn't him. I'm convinced. I'm convinced that that was not what he wanted. But it comes back to reflect upon him. So when Roosevelt runs against him, there's hardly any battle at all. Hoover leaves defeated. Hoover does try to get another term. And there are some conservatives, there are some people who believe that had Hoover had another term in office, that the Depression would have gotten a little bit better. And we wouldn't have needed all of those programs that were inserted in and we're still paying for now. But it's another one of those what ifs. We'll never know. We'll never know. So Hoover leaves feeling like he was a failure, and in many ways maybe he was, and leaves with a bad name. Come in with such a wonderful name as a hero, and then to leave with such a bad name. These tent villages that were raising up because people were losing their houses and they were just kind of setting up tents everywhere and little shacks. They were called Hoovervilles. A newspaper was called a Hoover Blanket. It was, all of it got his name because he was being blamed because he was the one in leadership and he should be doing something. But it's all about your view of what the person in charge should be doing. And I want your opinion on that. If we were in class, we would have a pretty big debate on this. So I want to hear your opinions in the comments. Go back to that screen where it says the two roles, the two responses. This one. What do you think the government's role is? Okay, directly giving money or trying to support the economy so that the people can get their own money. Okay, as much as the understanding is that you have, okay, give me your opinion. You can also ask me questions underneath if there's things that are still confusing you about this or how this actually works. Okay, because this is important to really understanding how government works and the jobs of our presidents. Okay, I want to hear your opinion below on what you think the president's role is, especially in this kind of situation, in a depression type situation. What do you think he should have done? Is there something else? If you were Hoover's advisor, would you have advised him to do something different? Okay.